This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host Phil Goldberg in a special edition of Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. We're going to be doing a series on Yogananda, and Phil has written a book recently that's now available, The Life of Yogananda, the story of the yogi who became the first modern guru. So rather than Phil and I interviewing somebody, I'll be interviewing Phil, and very exciting. I got a copy of the book online, and Phil, of course, has been working, and I know this, having been working with him the last few years, very diligently on this book, and it's come to fruition. Well, first, Phil, congratulations for completing the book.
Well, thank you, sir. I am very happy that it's almost out.
Right.
When this airs for the first time, it will still be in the pre-sales phase, and it will be published and available for purchase on April 24th, this 2018, of course. And right now, people can pre-order it online.
Phil, okay. Obviously, you have an interest in contemporary spirituality, as do I. What motivated you to write a book specifically on Yogananda?
Well, I read his autobiography of a yogi in like 1969 or 70. And it was a very important book in my own spiritual path, as it was and has been and continues to be for millions of people. I never became a disciple of Yogananda or officially a student of his, but I read his work a lot and just always had a fondness for him and a lot of gratitude for everything I learned from his work, and especially the autobiography, which was really a mind-blowing experience back then. And then when I was working on American Veda, and I was writing about all the gurus who came here, he ended up having a whole chapter because he was so important. And in researching his life, the human story of his life I found very fascinating. And of course, I only had one chapter to devote to it, so it was a little frustrating. But so later on, after American Veda was out and I was thinking about what to do next, the thought of really digging in and telling his entire life story in a book became very appealing, and it got carried away.
Right. Now, in the book, Phil, you make a distinction between the man, Yogananda, and the guru, Yogananda. How are they intertwined, and where was your focus?
Well, it's not so much that I separate them, but it's just that I chose to emphasize the narrative of his life and his personality, which was fascinating, the events of his life, remarkable things happened to him. I chose to emphasize that as opposed to the teachings that he brought out, because those are available. There are thousands of pages of Yogananda's writings and teachings available, and there are some sort of slim memoirs written by people who were disciples of his back in the 30s and 40s and 50s that talked about, what he was like as a guru to them. And so I wanted to tell the full human story because to me that was most fascinating piece of it. And there was so much that had never been told before, not in his own autobiography or his any of the memoirs that were written by people who knew him.
How many folks were you able to speak to who had actually spent time with Yogananda?
One.
Right.
Just one, because Yogananda died 66 years ago, and only people who are rather old would have known him, and they would have known him toward the end of his life. when I was researching the book, the president of Self-Realization Fellowship was a direct disciple, but she was inaccessible. She was quite old,
Mm-hmm.
and she died right before I finished the book. And but Roy Eugene Davis, who is one of the people we've interviewed
Right.
for this series on Yogananda,
Right.
so people can look forward to hearing our interview with him.
Fascinating man. Mm-hmm.
So he was a direct disciple because he met Yogananda in the late 40s when he was not even 20 years old, when Roy was not 20 years old. So and he's still living, and so we spoke to him. I spoke to him, and then we spoke to him for the show. And but I was not able to speak to any other direct disciples. There were only a few remaining, and they were quite old and inaccessible.
Right. But he was extensively covered in the news. He was extensively written about, I would think, about by his disciples. So there was a lot of information there. When you went in
Yeah.
to writing the book, I'm sure you had certain expectations in terms of what you would be writing about or what his life reflected. What were some of the things that surprised you, though?
There were a couple of surprises. One, and the main one, was how much he dealt with just human struggles
Mm-hmm.
in his work, in his life in America, starting and running a big spiritual organization that was the foundation for his mission, which to bring the teachings of his Kriya Yoga lineage to the West. And he came in 1920, and was very different from the era you and I were in
Mm-hmm.
the 60s when there were a lot of gurus. The world was very different 40, 50 years prior to that. And being a monk with dark skin and long hair was much more harrowing experience than it was later. And he was, there was not much precedent for it. So, and then, he was here through the Roaring Twenties, and then the Great Depression and World War II. So, there were hard times, and he struggled a lot more than we think, great yogis should. Or because we have this illusion that things should be easy for them, but he had to deal with money and organizations and mortgages and deprivation and personal hassles with the
Mm-hmm.
people who worked for him, much more than we realized. And I think that was one of the more endearing things, that he was fairly open about all that stuff. He didn't hide behind spiritual
Right.
pablum. He dealt with stuff, and he was worried about money right throughout his whole life. Not money for himself, but money to make sure that his organization would continue to thrive, and long after his passing. So
Right.
that was surprising, and I learned a lot about the nuances of his life in India before he came here, which were I didn't know about. And there were things like lawsuits that were in the newspapers, and a lot of scurrilous accusations thrown at him, and a lot of really difficult things to deal with. And he, you see in his letters that he at times just wanted to give it up and go back to India and live a simple life as a monk,
Mm-hmm.
but he never did. He
Yeah,
kept
a
at it.
couple of things that have always surprised me in what I've read about Yogananda, from Autobiography of a Yogi, and other readings I've done, and certainly from what I've seen in your book, was that he came here in the late 20s, early 30s, or whatever, and he was
1920.
okay. He was drawing big crowds even back then,
Yes,
and so I was
yes.
really surprised to see that. You see these photos of all these men and nicely dressed women and men in suits and ties and all. So really, like, not what the hippies that used to go to the gurus in the 60s, but this was straight laced folks, and so that surprised me, the amount of people that
Yeah,
came.
me too.
And then I also wondered, and maybe you could speak on this. there have been in the last few decades, especially certain Christian sects in the United States that feel very threatened by anything coming from the East. Certainly, anything that hints of Hinduism or meditation or something that isn't directly in Christian lineage. Did he get a lot of that in his time teaching in the States?
Yeah, he did. All the gurus did.
Hmm.
Vivekananda had it even worse, because he was here, 30 years earlier.
Hmm.
And some of the other swamis who had come in Vivekananda's lineage in the early part of the 20th century, they dealt with a lot. There were the sort of heathen are coming. There were lurid sort of fears of these dark-skinned swamis hypnotizing American women to have their way with them, and things like that. But there was also the usual conservative Christian, this is heathens and this is false religion, and don't fall for it. I mean, from my research in not only this book in the life of Yogananda, but also in American Veda, there's always been two kinds of Americans, and one, he was filling auditoriums. He filled Carnegie Hall
Hmm.
and the Philharmonic Hall in L.A. and Symphony Hall in Boston. Not at first. At first, he was lucky if he got a dozen people in a room, but then the reputation grew, and he was filling big spaces. And those were the open-minded American people who want to hear about something new and are searching and are willing to listen to see if something's of use. And that spirit of open-minded inquiry has always, been one of the great hallmarks of American life. But there's always a backlash too,
Right.
and so there are always conservative people who are xenophobic and chauvinistic about their religion and their ethnicity, and he was a dark-skinned man at a time when one of the years in the mid-20s, there were millions of Ku Klux Klansmen at that
Right.
time, and they had marches in Washington with 50,000 people, and here was Yogananda, and he ran into a lot of that racial bigotry as well as religious bigotry, and especially when he ventured into the South.
Hmm.
So, and by the 60s and 70s in our time, things had changed considerably. But even the gurus in that era, dealt with stuff like that.
Right. And did his focus from the time he came to America to the time he died, did it stay primarily the same, or did his focus change in terms of what he was emphasizing in his teaching and what he did?
Yeah, it's a good question. In one respect, it was always the
Hmm.
same basic message of, what we think of as Vedanta philosophy or yogic philosophy, and the same Kriya Yoga meditation and breathing practices and so forth, so with some nuances in terms of how they were delivered and how they were, who was allowed to take which course, and those kinds of nuances changed over time. But he was one of the hallmarks of his work as a spiritual teacher was he was very traditional and honored his lineage and upheld it and was very faithful to it as a matter of maintaining the
Hmm.
teachings and the methods in their integrity. But he also realized he couldn't just do things the traditional way of one guru instructing one person at a time. If he wanted to reach large numbers of Americans, if he wanted all those people who came to hear him speak to then have methods to practice and ongoing teachings, he couldn't be a guru to everybody. He was moving around the country. He was traveling. And, it's a big place. And so he had to do certain innovative things that not everybody favored. The traditionalists didn't like when
Mm-hmm.
he would put certain teachings in writing and distribute them by with correspondence course, which would have been then in the 20s and 30s the equivalent of putting things online. Now, you
Mm-hmm.
get mail order lessons. And that was an innovation, and it was a departure from tradition. And you could see the changes also in his lecture titles when he realized, as a lot of other gurus did later on, as the ones we're familiar with, not everybody wants to know about higher consciousness and spiritual awakening and realization. They want to know, is what you're teaching going to, help me earn my living? Is it going to make me healthier? Is it going to, make my marriage better? And so he started to address those
Right,
subjects as
right,
well as the more abstract.
right. And I also wonder, back in the day, let's say in the 30s and 40s, when he was giving these large meetings, when people came, was his emphasis to them, hey, take this scientific teaching that I have of inner life, of meditation, of self-realization, and practice it on your own and enjoy it? Or was he asking them, come, I'm the teacher, come follow me. You don't have to become a renunciate like me, but I need to be your guru if you are really going to progress spiritually.
That's a very interesting question, because to a certain extent he honored the guru tradition, but
Mm-hmm.
he couldn't obviously have a personal close relationship with every student the way
Mm-hmm.
he did with his guru in a small little ashram in India. And
Right.
so there was this sense that if you could take the lessons and learn from him without any deep major commitment, and learn certain methods and so forth. But then there would be a moment where if you wanted to continue and have the advanced teachings and so forth, there was a commitment asked from the
Mm-hmm.
student. That was the equivalent of saying, I take Yogananda as my guru. And even if you didn't have much personal contact with him or any. And so that was a compromise, you could say, in a way of keeping the traditional guru-disciple relationship uh, alive, but also accommodating having to reach large
You're right.
numbers of people in different locations.
Mm-hmm. Now, we often think of a guru, or it's romanticized vision that many people have, as a very just pleasant, happy always person sitting and giving talks. Uh, in his day-to-day dealings with his disciples, with the people he interacted with, was there also some fire and fury there?
Yes.
Did he have a personality that could flare up occasionally and be very, almost frightening to the people around him because he was obviously very powerful?
Yes, well, that's a good insight, and you're probably asking that question because you've heard similar stories from other gurus. And
Yes.
he writes about that, about his own guru,
Mm-hmm.
about how tough his guru Sri Yukteswar could be, and how demanding, and how much of a disciplinarian at the same time, and mixed with this loving, gentle, all compassionate nature. So, they're in a close guru disciple relationship, it's not unlike a parent and a child, where you have this unconditional love and concern and care, and yet, when necessary, they would say, uh, tough love.
Mm-hmm.
And so Yogananda writes a lot about what he went through with his own guru, as
Mm-hmm.
his guru sort of shaped him into being a better human being and busted his ego. And Yogananda was known to be that way as well at times. When you read his disciples just talking about him, the love is and devotion is very powerful, very strong.
Mm-hmm.
Now, who knows? There could have been people who couldn't handle it and didn't like it and didn't like him and left. We don't have their memoirs,
Right.
but the people who stuck it out said, he could be very tough on me, but I always knew that he was doing it for my own good, and I had lessons to learn and so forth. So
Right.
he had both sides.
Now, there are a number of organizations that continue to propagate his teaching, the largest being the Self-Realization Fellowship. Have you had cooperation from all of these groups in the writing of your book? And even if you had cooperation, were there certain things they emphasized or they asked of you to bring out or not bring out in writing the book?
Um, I worked with all of the three. But SRF is, the dominant organization. It's the organization he started, and that is the keeper of most of the archives and the copyrighted materials and all that. And they're in LA, and so am I. So I spent a lot of time with them, and I had the cooperation in the research, and they gave me feedback on early materials to make sure I was factually correct, and they made certain requests, and I did my best to be honest and fair, and at the same time factually correct and objective. And I also worked with the people from Ananda, and the couple who runs Ananda will be among our guests in this series of 4 or 5 interviews about Yogananda, and we'll have a couple of SRF monks as well. And of course, the smaller organization that Roy Eugene Davis started. So I was in touch with all of them, and they shared with me what they could and what was appropriate from their own archives and their own knowledge base. And I had a good cooperative relationship with all of them. And I also, spoke to not organizations but individuals who were opponents of those organizations. Every guru has his,
They're out there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had this, I researched it as deeply as I could from all angles.
Phil, one thing I'm very curious about, and maybe in your research you encounter this, and it is now if somebody goes to a lecture on meditation or anything that has to do with Eastern philosophy or spirituality, they have some sense of karma and gurus and this and that and whatever. The crowds that Yogananda must have attracted in the late 20s, the 30s, and 40s, they must have come in there cold, because even when I was in the 60s, karma, yoga, all these things I'd never heard of,
Right.
and I was fairly more interested than the average person in Eastern
Yes.
philosophy. I'd done some philosophical study, but these crowds, their minds must have gotten blown, because they went in cold, and all of a sudden they're giving all this Vedic information and knowledge.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that, and how that
Well,
comes out in the book?
a
Yeah.
few things. One, that's true to a certain extent. But they also, a lot of the people who came didn't come completely ignorant, but they came with a lot of more misconceptions then than we do now, because we've been exposed to it so much. So they may have read about Hinduism from some terrible book, or some treatise on yoga that was badly translated or something. So they may have had more to unlearn. But also there was more of a more ground had been laid than we think, because Vivekananda had come in 1893, and by 1920 there were Vedanta societies in many of the major cities in America, run by swamis who were sent here from Vivekananda's lineage. So they had a presence, and in American Veda, I talk about Emerson and Thoreau and the advent of the schools of what came to be called New Thought, theosophy
Mm-hmm.
and unity churches and some of the other sort of metaphysical movements that started in the late 19th and early 20th century. So those were fairly popular, and word got out. So that from Yogananda would have drawn from those people. People who had some exposure would have been among or at least a lot of curiosity from what they've heard. That would have been
Right.
the target audience and the people who would come around, and then they would tell their friends, and the
Right.
women who would go to a metaphysical salon would bring their friends and the husbands, and things grew. And so if he had a big event, like when his first event in L.A. was in a Philharmonic auditorium that seats 3,000, and the L.A. Times said the place was packed, and another 3,000 were turned away.
Wow.
So there was enough interest in sort of these exotic Eastern forms for people to show up either out of curiosity or because they were really eager to meet a real yogi because of whatever they'd heard or read. It was nothing like the 60s and
Right.
70s, and certainly nothing like now. I mean, if a guru shows up in your town now, it's, so there's another guru showing
Yeah.
up. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
And he's not about to fill Carnegie Hall. But, you know,
It's
but
fascinating. It must have been a fascinating time. Phil, in the few minutes that we have remaining, what are some other things you'd like people to know about the book before they go out and get it and then read it?
well, if I were to advertise my own book, I would say those people who think they know a lot about Yogananda because they've read the autobiography and they've studied other uh, of his works and maybe read some of the other memoirs. There's a lot you don't know. There was a lot I didn't know, and so people will make new discoveries, and they'll find out more detail about things, parts of his life that they already knew about, but now they'll have more detail. There'll be a lot of fun discoveries. But there's one other thing I want to emphasize,
Mm-hmm.
and that is I told the story of his life. It's a fascinating narrative from birth to death. But if you read it the right way, there are really good lessons to be learned from his life and his example that can help us in our own spiritual development and our own sort of living our own life in a fuller way. And I I made a 20-minute audio about that called the life lessons from the life of Yogananda to make as a sort of free gift as an incentive to pre-order the book. So I may as well do a commercial for that now because it's I'd love to have
Mm-hmm.
people hearing this go and pre-order the book. So if you go to my website philipgoldberg.com, you can get that free audio to sort of help you read between the lines of the book if you pre-order it.
That's
But there's a lot to be
philipgoldberg.com.
learned and a lot to be gained. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Well, it's
philipgoldberg.com.
exciting and it's an exciting time. We all look forward to discussing the book with you more. And the book will be available beginning when?
Officially April 24th. But
2018. Get
yeah,
it? Like your book, American Veda. Actually, if somebody reads his autobiography of a yogi, American Veda, and the life of Yogananda, the story of the yogi who became the first modern guru, one will have a strong body of knowledge in
yes,
looking at and evaluating all things spiritual. I really think so because I mean, so much is covered, and the life of Yogananda is the life everybody should know. It's very inspiring, especially when we look at the world as it is. So much of what the world lacks was what he was offering it. So, in my opinion, and so
yeah,
yes, read the book and get spiritually inspired, and maybe we can all work a little bit more to change the world.
he did.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
that's one of the other things you'll find in the book. He spoke out a lot about the events of the world around him. I have a question for you, Dennis.
Yes.
We've done well over 100 or 130 or 40 interviews, and
Yes.
after each interview, you and I have a discussion. What are we going to do after
Well,
this
I think
interview?
after this one, our listeners could hear me talk to myself, uh, take on a variety of characters. I'm certainly willing to do that, or we could come up with something even more interesting or creative, or we could just let it sit as is.
Okay,
And
it'll be the one interview that does not have a discussion
yes,
after
but
it.
please write in to go to spiritmatterstalk.com. You'll see how to contact us, and we're happy to hear from you. And any questions about the book, direct them to Phil, and he will get back to you. So, uh, great. All right, Phil. Thanks for
Okay.
your time.
Well,
And
I want to thank you and your co-host for having me on.
yes, my co-host, who's the yes, my co-host who is now an interviewee. All right. Till
All
next
right.
time. All right. Bye.
Thanks.